This channel is for women who are doing fine, but feel quietly lost. I want to start by telling you something that might feel unsettling to hear. If your life looks stable from the outside, but something inside you feels muted, suspended, unnamed, there's nothing wrong with you. And yet, almost no one gives you permission to say that out loud. Because you're doing fine. You get up, you function, you show up, you keep the wheels turning, you answer texts, you remember birthdays, you handle work, family, responsibilities. You are reliable, capable, composed. From the outside, your life reads as complete. So when that quiet ache appears, when you feel strangely disconnected from your own days, when joy feels dulled and purpose feels blurry, you tell yourself to be grateful. You minimize it. You swallow it. And you assume this is just what adulthood feels like. But what if it isn't? What if the feeling you can't quite name isn't emptiness, but awareness? I'm speaking to the part of you that notices the silence once the house finally settles. The part of you that feels most honest late at night, when no one needs anything from you. The part that wonders, without drama or panic, is this really it? Not in a catastrophic way, not in a burn-it-all-down way, just in a quiet, persistent way that doesn't go away no matter how busy you stay. This is not a channel for women who are falling apart. It's for women who are holding everything together and slowly realizing that holding it together is not the same as being alive inside it. There is a specific kind of loneliness that only comes when your life looks full. Just you don't feel lost enough to ask for help. You don't feel unhappy enough to complain. You don't feel broken enough to be fixed. So you stay silent. You tell yourself this is just a phase, that everyone feels this way eventually, that you should be past wanting more. And yet, something in you keeps listening for a voice that sounds like truth instead of advice. That's why I'm here. Not to motivate you, not to fix you, not to give you a list of things to improve. I'm here to talk about the quiet middle, the space women enter when they've done what was expected of them, achieved what they were told would be enough, and still feel an unspoken distance from their own lives. This space is rarely acknowledged because it doesn't look dramatic. It doesn't come with obvious crisis or collapse. It comes with competence, with stability, and with a calendar full of obligations and a heart that feels slightly elsewhere. You might recognize it in small moments, standing in your kitchen, staring at nothing, unable to remember what you came in for, scrolling through your phone without interest, without desire, without comparison, just numbness, catching yourself fantasizing about silence, not escape, about space, not change. You don't want a new life. You just want to feel present in the one you have. But that desire alone can feel dangerous, indulgent, ungrateful. So you keep it to yourself. Women like us are rarely taught how to name dissatisfaction without shame. We're taught that wanting more must mean rejecting what we already have. That questioning our lives is a betrayal of the people who depend on us. So instead of asking honest questions, we adjust ourselves. Now we lower the volume on our inner voice. We stay productive. We stay agreeable. We stay busy enough not to feel the ache too clearly, until one day the quiet becomes louder than the noise. That's usually when women find this channel. Not during crisis, but during pause, during the moment when life finally slows down just enough for the truth to surface. This is not a space for quick answers. It's not a space for 5 steps or mindset shifts. And it's definitely not a space for pretending that everything is fine just because it looks that way. This is a space for women who feel suspended between who they were and who they're becoming, and don't yet have language for that in-between place. Here, We talk about the friendships that no longer fit, but never ended cleanly. The relationships that look healthy, but feel strangely hollow, and the goals that were achieved and somehow didn't deliver the meaning they promised. The guilt that surfaces the moment you try to choose yourself without explanation. We talk about the fatigue of always being the strong one, the quiet grief of outgrowing old identities, the disorientation that comes when you realize you don't want what you used to want, but you're not sure what comes next. This isn't about self-improvement. It's about self-honesty. It's about finally allowing yourself to admit that something feels off without immediately trying to correct it. Because clarity doesn't come from rushing. It comes from listening. And most women were never taught how to listen to themselves without judgment. If you've made it this far, it's likely because something in you recognized this tone. Not excitement, not urgency, recognition. So before we go any further, I want to ask you for something simple. If you feel seen here, even uncomfortably so, subscribe to this channel. Not because I want to grow, but because this kind of conversation only continues when women quietly choose it. Subscribing tells me you're here for depth, not noise. For truth, not performance. For companionship, not instruction. It tells me to keep showing up for the women who don't need saving, but do need language for what they're living. Because you're not broken, you're not behind, and you're not failing at life. You're just in the middle, and that deserves to be spoken about, slowly, honestly, and without apology. Toxic friends, when history lasts longer than honesty. There was a moment when I realized I was staying in certain friendships, not because they still felt true, but because leaving them would require a kind of honesty I had never practiced before. It wasn't a dramatic realization. It didn't arrive with anger or betrayal. It arrived on an ordinary afternoon, the kind that leaves no mark on a calendar. I had just spent a few hours with someone who had been part of my life for years, someone who knew my past well enough to finish my sentences, someone I would have called one of my closest friends without hesitation. And yet, when I got home, I felt strangely hollow, not upset, not hurt, just quieter inside myself, as if I had folded something away during the conversation and forgotten to unfold it again. That was when it first occurred to me that history can outlive honesty. We talk a lot about toxic friendships, as if they're obvious. Manipulative, cruel, competitive, dramatic. But some of the most damaging friendships don't look toxic at all. They look familiar, comfortable, reasonable. They are built on shared years, shared memories, shared survival, and that's exactly why they're so hard to question. For a long time, I believed that longevity itself was proof of value. If a friendship had lasted through marriages, divorces, career changes, children, relocations, then it must be solid, worth preserving, worth enduring. What I didn't realize was that endurance and alignment are not the same thing. Some friendships survive because both people keep changing together. Others survive because one person stops changing out loud. I had learned how to do that very well. I learned how to listen without responding fully, how to offer empathy without revealing myself, how to nod, laugh, agree, and gently redirect when conversations drifted toward places where I no longer lived. I told myself this was maturity, emotional intelligence, flexibility. But it was also self-abandonment, practiced quietly and consistently. The truth is, many friendships are formed at a specific stage of life for a specific reason. Some are born in survival, some in proximity, some in shared confusion, some in rebellion, some in loneliness. And when that stage ends, the friendship is supposed to evolve or end. But women are rarely taught how to let friendships end without catastrophe. We're taught that walking away without a clear offense makes us disloyal, ungrateful, cold. So instead of leaving, we adapt ourselves. We stay, but we shrink. We stop bringing certain parts of ourselves into the room, our curiosity, our ambition, our softness, our grief, and our joy. We learn which topics land well and which ones don't. We sense when our growth creates discomfort, and we quietly tuck it away. Over time, the friendship becomes a place we visit, not a place we inhabit. And still we stay. Because history is heavy. Because memories feel like evidence. Because we remember who they were to us when we needed someone. What we don't often ask is who we are allowed to be now. There is a subtle loneliness that comes from being known for who you used to be. It's not dramatic enough to complain about. It doesn't come with obvious harm, but it erodes something essential. Your sense of being met in the present. I noticed it in the smallest ways. The way my excitement dimmed mid-sentence. The way I edited stories before telling them. The way I left conversations feeling strangely unseen, even though nothing unkind had been said. This is the part that's hardest to explain to people who haven't felt it. There is no accusation to make, no wrongdoing to point to, just an internal dissonance that grows louder the more you ignore it. Eventually, I had to stop asking whether these friendships were good or bad and start asking a different question. Do I feel like myself here? Not the self I used to be, the self I am now. That question changed everything, because the answer was often no, and not in a way that blamed anyone else. It simply acknowledged that something fundamental had shifted. One of the most uncomfortable truths I've learned is that growth doesn't just change us. It exposes the limits of certain relationships, especially relationships that relied on us staying in a particular emotional position. Sometimes we were the listener, sometimes the helper, sometimes the one who needed less, asked less, took up less space. When that changes, the dynamic trembles, and not everyone wants to renegotiate the unspoken agreement. Some people respond to your growth with curiosity. Others respond with subtle resistance. They may not say anything outright. Instead, they withdraw when you speak about what matters to you now. They go quiet when you succeed. They steer conversations back to familiar ground. You start to feel like you're walking slightly ahead of them. And instead of catching up, they ask you to slow down. At first you do, because you love them, because you don't want to seem changed, because you don't want to be that person who outgrows everyone. But over time, slowing down starts to feel like standing still. And this is where guilt enters the room. Women are deeply conditioned to feel guilty for changing in ways that disrupt emotional comfort. We're told that loyalty means staying accessible, that care means continuity, that maturity means compromise. But compromise without reciprocity becomes quiet resentment, and resentment, when swallowed, becomes numbness. I didn't wake up one day and decide certain friendships were no longer for me. I arrived there slowly, through a series of honest observations I could no longer ignore. I noticed how often I felt relieved when plans were canceled, how rarely I felt truly understood after sharing something personal, how often I left feeling like I had performed a role rather than shared a life. These weren't dramatic red flags. They were patterns, repeated over time, easy to dismiss individually, too impossible to deny collectively. What I had to accept was this: not every friendship is meant to grow with you, and that doesn't make it a failure. Some friendships do exactly what they were meant to do. They get you through a chapter. They hold you while you learn something essential about yourself, and then quietly, they reach their natural end. The tragedy isn't in letting them go. It's in forcing them to continue when the fit is gone. Letting go doesn't always mean confrontation. Sometimes it means distance, less availability, fewer explanations, more honesty with yourself than with anyone else. This is where many women get stuck. We feel we owe clarity to everyone but ourselves. We think if we can't articulate a clean reason, we shouldn't change our behavior. But your nervous system doesn't need a justification. It needs safety. And you are allowed to step back from relationships that no longer feel reciprocal, even if they once were. You are allowed to change without issuing a press release. You are allowed to honor who you are becoming, even if it confuses people who knew you before. There is grief in this, real grief, for the shared past, for the ease that once existed, for the version of yourself who belonged there without effort. That grief deserves acknowledgement, not dismissal. But staying out of guilt is not kindness, to them or to you. What I've learned is that the healthiest friendships don't rely on nostalgia to survive. They are rooted in presence, in mutual curiosity, in the willingness to meet each other where you are now, not where you used to be. And when that willingness isn't there, no amount of history can replace it. If you're listening to this and someone comes to mind, I don't want you to rush into decisions. This isn't about cutting people off. It's about telling yourself the truth without minimizing it. Pay attention to where you feel most yourself. Pay attention to where you feel subtly diminished. Pay attention to where your honesty feels like a disruption rather than a welcome. Friendships are not meant to require self-erasure, and choosing honesty over history is not an act of cruelty. It's an act of self-respect, quiet, difficult, and deeply necessary. Some connections are meant to stay, some are meant to change, and some are meant to be honored for what they were, not what we keep asking them to be. Recognizing the difference is not a failure of loyalty. It's a sign that you are finally listening to yourself. On dating drama without the drama. I used to think dating drama meant chaos, arguments, betrayal, emotional whiplash, the kind of stories that come with raised eyebrows and urgent phone calls to friends. But the dating fatigue I feel now doesn't look like that at all. It looks quiet, polite, civil. It looks like sitting across from someone who checks every reasonable box and feeling absolutely nothing move inside me. It looks like conversations that flow easily but never go anywhere real. It looks like going home alone afterward, not heartbroken, just strangely untouched. For a long time I told myself this was maturity, that passion naturally fades with age, that expectations should soften, that stability matters more than spark. And some of that is true. But what I eventually had to face was this. I wasn't exhausted from dating people who hurt me. I was exhausted from dating people I didn't want to disappoint. There's a particular kind of emotional erosion that happens when you keep saying yes out of politeness instead of desire. When you give chances not because you feel curious, but because you feel obligated to be open-minded. When you stay engaged because nothing is technically wrong, even though nothing is right either. I've had dinners that lasted too long because I didn't know how to leave without seeming rude. Walks that felt endless because the conversation was pleasant but hollow. Second dates that happened simply because the first wasn't bad enough to decline. And after each one, I'd ask myself the same quiet question. Why do I feel more alone now than I did before I arrived? And this is the dating drama no one warns you about, the slow disconnect from your own intuition. When you're younger, red flags tend to wave loudly. With time, they soften into neutral tones. Emotional unavailability starts calling itself busy. Indifference dresses up as low drama. Lack of curiosity hides behind laid back. Nothing about it feels alarming. That's the problem. I've learned that loneliness and longing are not the same thing. Loneliness is wanting company. Longing is wanting resonance. And too often I was confusing the two. I wasn't craving connection because I lacked people in my life. I was craving it because I missed being met. I missed feeling seen without explaining myself. I missed conversations that lingered in my body after they ended. Instead, I kept encountering something else. Emotional minimums disguised as adequacy. Men who showed up on time, paid for dinner, texted back. Men who were kind, stable, emotionally neutral. Men who never asked a question that surprised me. There's no villain in that story, just misalignment. But I stayed longer than I needed to because I didn't trust myself to leave without a clear justification. I thought desire needed to be logical. I thought attraction should be rational. What I didn't understand then was that my body already knew what my mind was trying to negotiate away. After enough of these experiences, I stopped asking whether someone was a good option and started asking a simpler question. Do I feel more like myself around them or less? Not excited, not impressed, not validated. Myself. The answer came quickly once I learned how to listen. Dating without drama doesn't mean dating without emotion. It means refusing to manufacture interest where there is none. It means honoring the quiet signals instead of overriding them with good manners and social conditioning. I've noticed how often women like me are praised for being flexible, understanding, patient. Those qualities serve relationships, but they can also keep us stuck in situations that quietly drain us. Because flexibility without discernment becomes self-erasure. There's a cultural narrative that suggests if you're not wildly enthusiastic, you're emotionally unavailable. That if you don't feel instant chemistry, you're guarded. That if you don't give something time, you're unrealistic. But time doesn't create alignment. It only reveals it. I've also learned that boredom is not the same as calm. Calm feels spacious. Boredom feels flat. Calm allows curiosity. Boredom shuts it down. For a long time, I told myself to be grateful for calm when what I was actually feeling was disengagement. And disengagement doesn't deepen with patience. It just becomes more polite. Dating at this stage of life requires a different kind of honesty. Not the dramatic kind, but the internal kind. The honesty that admits when you're showing up out of habit instead of desire. When you're staying present because you don't want to hurt someone, even though you're already hurting yourself in small, invisible ways. I no longer believe that wanting something specific makes me difficult, or that declining what's available makes me ungrateful. I've seen what happens when I settle for fine. Fine is how time disappears. The absence of drama isn't the goal. Presence is. I don't need intensity. I don't need fireworks. I don't need to be chased or convinced. But I do need to feel awake. I need conversations that don't feel interchangeable. I need silences that don't feel awkward. I need to feel like I'm participating in something real, not auditioning for compatibility. Dating without drama has taught me that peace doesn't come from lowering standards. It comes from clarifying them. Not on paper, not in theory, but in the body. And when something isn't there, it's okay to name that quietly and move on. Not because something better is guaranteed, but because staying where you're disconnected is its own kind of loss. I don't date to fill space anymore, and I date to see what responds when I show up as I am. And if nothing responds, I let the silence tell me what I need to know. That, to me, is what dating without drama actually means. Healthy relationships feel quiet, and that can be unsettling. The first time I found myself inside a healthy relationship, I didn't recognize it as love. There was no rush, no emotional vertigo, No sense of urgency that made my heart race or my thoughts spiral. There was no dramatic pull, no intensity I had to decode, no highs so high they made the lows feel inevitable. There was just quiet. And that quiet unsettled me more than chaos ever had. I remember waiting for something to go wrong. Not consciously, not dramatically, but in the background of my body. I stayed alert in moments that were meant to be ordinary. I listened for a change in tone. As I watched for a shift in behavior, I scanned conversations for hidden meaning, as if calm was only temporary and danger was simply being polite. Nothing happened, and instead of relaxing into that, I grew suspicious. This was the part no one warned me about. When you've spent years associating love with emotional intensity, peace doesn't feel safe. It feels unfamiliar. It feels empty. It feels like something is missing, even when nothing is wrong. I had learned to read love through adrenaline, through longing, through tension, through the constant work of maintaining connection. So when connection no longer required work, I didn't trust it. Healthy relationships don't announce themselves with fireworks. They don't demand constant attention. They don't pull you into emotional loops that keep you guessing where you stand. They exist quietly, steadily, without asking you to prove your worth. And that kind of steadiness can feel deeply uncomfortable if you were taught that love must be earned. I noticed how my body reacted to consistency, how my nervous system didn't know what to do when there was nothing to brace against, no emotional roller coaster to ride, no chaos to manage, no distance to close. I felt exposed, because without conflict or intensity, there was nowhere to hide, no role to perform, no problem to solve. I had to show up exactly as I was, without strategy. That kind of intimacy is far more vulnerable than drama. In unhealthy dynamics, chaos creates distraction. It keeps you focused on survival instead of presence. It gives you something to fix, something to endure, something to blame when you don't feel grounded. Healthy love removes those distractions. What's left is you, your moods, your fears, your patterns, your silences, and that can be terrifying. I realized how accustomed I was to equating emotional intensity with depth. If something didn't feel urgent, I assumed it wasn't meaningful. If there were no highs and lows, I questioned whether there was chemistry at all. But chemistry fueled by instability isn't intimacy. It's conditioning. I had to unlearn the belief that calm meant boredom, and boredom meant incompatibility. I had to sit with the discomfort of not being activated, not being needed in the same frantic way, not being pulled into someone else's emotional weather. Healthy relationships feel quiet because they don't hijack your nervous system. They don't require vigilance. They don't reward self-abandonment. They don't confuse anxiety with passion. Instead, and they invite you to settle. And settling, not settling for, but settling into, was something I didn't know how to do. I noticed it in the smallest moments. Shared mornings that didn't need plans. Silence that didn't need filling. Disagreements that didn't threaten the entire relationship. There was room to breathe. At first, that room felt like distance. I was so used to closeness being loud, to love being proven through intensity, to connection requiring constant reassurance. So when reassurance was simply present, I didn't know how to receive it. I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. That's what unresolved patterns do. They keep you living in anticipation of loss, even when nothing is being taken away. The unsettling part of healthy love is that it asks you to stay present instead of prepared, to respond instead of react, to trust without guarantees. And trust, when you've been shaped by inconsistency, feels like exposure. There were moments when I caught myself wanting to create tension, just to feel something familiar, to pick a fight, to pull away slightly, to test the connection. Not because I wanted drama, but because drama had once been proof of care. I had to sit with that impulse and recognize it for what it was, a nervous system seeking what it knew, not what it needed. Healthy relationships don't make you feel chosen through urgency. They make you feel chosen through continuity, through the quiet decision to show up again and again without spectacle. That kind of love doesn't spike dopamine. It builds safety. And safety for many of us doesn't feel romantic at first. It feels foreign. And I also had to confront the part of me that equated being loved with being needed. In calmer relationships, I wasn't required to fix, manage, or rescue. My value wasn't tied to emotional labor. That left me with a question I hadn't asked before. If I'm not needed, who am I here? The answer wasn't immediate. It unfolded slowly as I learned to let go of old roles, as I allowed myself to receive instead of perform, as I stopped mistaking peace for disinterest. Healthy relationships feel quiet because they don't consume you. They integrate into your life rather than overtaking it. They leave space for your individuality, your friendships, your inner world. They don't ask you to shrink or expand to fit a dynamic. They adjust with you. This doesn't mean they're effortless. It means the effort isn't rooted in fear. There is still communication and still compromise, still moments of discomfort. But the foundation isn't instability. It's mutual regard. And that foundation changes everything. I had to learn that attraction doesn't have to feel like urgency, that desire can be steady, that connection can deepen without intensity, that love doesn't have to hurt to be real. That lesson didn't arrive all at once. It arrived through staying when my instinct was to flee, through resisting the urge to label calm as boredom, through allowing myself to be known without performing. The unsettling part eventually softened. What replaced it wasn't excitement in the way I had once defined it. It was something quieter, more grounded, more sustainable. I felt less consumed and more myself. Healthy relationships don't make your life louder. They make it clearer. And they don't give you something to escape into. They give you somewhere to rest. And rest when you're not used to it can feel undeserved. I've learned to recognize that feeling, not as a sign something is wrong, but as a sign I'm unlearning something old. Because when love no longer feels chaotic, it stops distracting you from yourself. It reflects you back instead. And that reflection can be unsettling. But it's also where real intimacy begins. Goals. When achievement feels strangely empty. I remember the moment clearly, not because it was dramatic, but because of how little it felt. I had reached something I once wanted badly, a goal that had lived in my imagination for years. One of those milestones you assume will change how you see yourself, how you wake up in the morning, how solid the ground beneath you feels. Instead, and I felt neutral, not disappointed, not proud, just oddly still. I waited for the feeling to arrive, the relief, the joy, the sense of arrival everyone talks about. I told myself it might come later, once the reality settled in. But days passed, and then weeks, and nothing shifted. Life continued at the same pace. I continued at the same pace. That was the first time I realized how little we talk about the quiet aftermath of achievement. We spend so much time chasing goals that no one prepares us for what happens when we reach them and discover they don't answer the questions we thought they would. No one tells you that success can feel strangely empty, not because it's meaningless, but because it has already done its work before it ever shows up. The truth is, by the time I reached that goal, I'd already become the person capable of carrying it. The growth happened invisibly, long before the result. So when the achievement finally arrived, it felt familiar, normal, almost anticlimactic. And that realization unsettled me more than failure ever had. Because if this wasn't the moment that made everything make sense, then what was I supposed to be moving toward? For women like me, goals are rarely just about ambition. They're about identity. They're about becoming someone who feels solid, worthy, complete. We're taught, quietly, persistently, that fulfillment lives somewhere ahead of us. That if we just keep going, keep striving, keep improving, there will be a moment when the restlessness finally resolves. But what happens when it doesn't? What happens when you reach what you once wanted and realize the longing has simply changed shape? I didn't feel ungrateful. I felt confused. I had done what I was supposed to do. I had built, achieved, maintained. I had checked boxes that once felt significant. And yet beneath all of that, there was a subtle sense of dislocation, as if I had been climbing toward something that no longer existed by the time I arrived. This is where many women quietly panic, not outwardly, not in a way anyone else can see, but internally, a question starts circling. If this isn't it, then what am I doing? We rarely voice that question because it feels dangerous, because dissatisfaction at this stage of life is often mistaken for ingratitude, because we've been taught that wanting more or wanting something different means rejecting the life we've built. And so instead, we keep going. We set new goals quickly, almost reflexively. Another project, another milestone, another version of ourselves to chase. We stay in motion because stillness might force us to sit with the emptiness we don't know how to name. But I've learned that emptiness isn't always a lack. Sometimes it's a pause between identities. There's a kind of grief that surfaces when old goals lose their charge. Not because they were wrong, but because they belong to a version of you who no longer exists. We don't talk enough about that grief. We treat it as failure or boredom or lack of motivation. In reality, it's transition. I started noticing how much of my drive had been fueled by becoming rather than being, how often my sense of worth was tethered to forward motion, to progress, to proof. When that motion slowed, even briefly, I felt unmoored. This is the quiet danger of goal-oriented living, when achievement becomes a substitute for self-connection, when movement keeps us from asking whether the direction still makes sense. I wasn't burned out. I wasn't lost. I was simply no longer aligned with the same definitions of success. But alignment doesn't announce itself loudly. It arrives as discomfort, as restlessness, as a subtle dissatisfaction that doesn't have an obvious cause. I had to stop asking, what should I want next? And start asking a more uncomfortable question. Who am I now without the chase? That question didn't have an immediate answer, and that was part of the problem. We live in a culture that values clarity and decisiveness. We're encouraged to pivot quickly, to reinvent, to rebrand ourselves whenever something stops working. But not every season calls for reinvention. Some seasons call for integration, for sitting with what has already been built and asking what it means now. I realized that some of my goals had served their purpose, not by fulfilling me, but by shaping me. They taught me discipline, resilience, self-trust. They gave me structure during times when I needed direction, and then, quietly, they were done. The emptiness I felt wasn't failure. It was space. Space I wasn't used to inhabiting. I noticed how uncomfortable I was without something specific to strive toward, how easily I reached for comparison during those moments, how tempting it was to measure my life against others' milestones, as if their clarity might substitute for my own. But comparison didn't motivate me, and it only amplified the sense that I was behind. behind some invisible timeline I had never consciously agreed to. This is the part of midlife achievement that feels so disorienting. You realize you're not running out of time, but you're no longer running toward the same things, and no one hands you a map for what comes next. There's also a quiet shame attached to this phase, a belief that if you're still searching after achieving so much, something must be wrong with you. That fulfillment should be automatic by now. That meaning should have settled. But meaning isn't static. It shifts as we do. What fulfilled me 10 years ago doesn't have to fulfill me now, and acknowledging that doesn't erase the value of what came before. It honors it. I had to give myself permission to grieve goals without immediately replacing them, or to resist the urge to fill the space just to feel productive, to let myself exist without a clear next milestone. That was harder than striving, because striving comes with direction, with validation, with momentum. Pausing comes with uncertainty, with questions no one else can answer for you. I learned that not every season of life is meant to feel ambitious. Some are meant to feel reflective, spacious, undefined. And that doesn't mean you're wasting time. It means you're listening. The emptiness after achievement isn't a signal to push harder. It's an invitation to reassess what success means now, not intellectually, but emotionally, somatically, in the quiet moments when no one is watching. What do you feel drawn toward when there's nothing to prove? What holds your attention when productivity isn't the goal? What feels nourishing rather than impressive? These questions don't produce instant clarity. They produce honesty. And honesty, at this stage of life, is more valuable than momentum. I no longer chase goals to feel complete. I let them emerge from who I already am. And sometimes that means living without a clear objective for a while. That space is uncomfortable, but it's also alive, because when achievement stops distracting you, you're finally left with yourself. And that, however unsettling, is where the next chapter actually begins. Self-love. Without performance, for most of my life, I believed self-love was something you could demonstrate. I believed it had a posture, a tone of voice, a vocabulary. I believed it showed up as confidence that didn't waver, boundaries that sounded calm and reasonable, routines that looked intentional instead of desperate. I believed self-love was something other people could recognize in you and quietly approve of. What I didn't understand then was that I had learned to love myself in a way that still required permission. I learned how to frame my needs so they wouldn't inconvenience anyone, how to soften my boundaries with explanations, how to present rest as something I deserved because I had earned it. Even my healing had a performance element. I wasn't choosing myself freely. I was negotiating for space. That distinction matters more than it seems. Because when self-love is conditional, it becomes another role to play, another standard to meet, another version of yourself to manage. I was very good at that. I could say no with a smile. I could articulate my feelings without raising my voice, and I could step back healthily, maturely, with grace. And still, underneath all of that, I felt tired in a way that had nothing to do with effort. There was a moment, quiet, almost insignificant, when something shifted. I didn't label it growth. I didn't recognize it as insight. I was standing alone at night, in a room that didn't need anything from me, realizing I wanted nothing. No conversation, no distraction, no explanation, just stillness. And the first feeling that surfaced wasn't relief, it was guilt. I immediately reached for reasons. I've had a long day. I'll make it up later. I should check in tomorrow, as if wanting to be alone required justification. That was when I understood something I had been avoiding for years. If loving myself still requires a defense, I am not actually loving myself. I am asking for approval. Women like me are trained early to equate worth with emotional availability. We learn that being good means being reachable, responsive, accommodating. We are praised for being strong, which often means being quiet about our needs and fluent in everyone else's. So when we begin to turn inward, it feels like a violation of an unspoken rule. We're allowed to take care of ourselves, but not too much. We're allowed to rest, but only after everything else is done. We're allowed to choose ourselves, but only if we can explain why. It's not self-love, it's conditional tolerance. I began to notice how often guilt followed my most honest choices. Not the big ones, the small ones. Leaving early without an excuse. Not responding immediately. Canceling something simply because I didn't have the capacity. The guilt didn't come from the present moment. It came from old conditioning, from years of believing that my comfort was secondary, that my needs were flexible, that my value lived in how little I asked for. Self-love without performance asks you to dismantle that belief quietly, not by affirmations, not by declarations, but by behavior that doesn't ask to be understood. I had to learn that real self-love often feels awkward, even rude, even selfish at first, because it doesn't come with a script. There is no applause for choosing yourself privately, no reassurance that you're doing it right, no immediate reward. Sometimes there's only discomfort and the unsettling feeling of disappointing people who are used to your availability. And that discomfort can feel like failure if you don't recognize it for what it is. I had spent so many years being the emotionally capable one, and the one who could hold space, the one who could adapt, the one who didn't make things harder. Letting go of that identity felt like grief, not because it was wrong, but because it had once kept me safe. Being agreeable had protected me from conflict. Being understanding had made me valuable. Being low maintenance had kept relationships intact, but it had also kept me distant from myself. Self-love without performance is not about becoming more confident or healed or self-assured. It's about becoming less explainable. It's about making choices that feel true even when they look unreasonable from the outside. It's about allowing yourself to be misunderstood without rushing to correct the narrative. I stopped asking whether something was good for me and started asking whether it was honest. That question stripped away a lot of noise. And honesty doesn't always look composed. It doesn't always sound enlightened. Sometimes it sounds simple, abrupt, final. Sometimes it looks like opting out without a speech. Sometimes it looks like resting without recovery goals. Sometimes it looks like not fixing the emotional temperature of a room. Self-love without performance doesn't clean itself up, doesn't make sense to everyone. It doesn't translate into productivity. It doesn't guarantee approval, and that's what makes it real. I also had to face how deeply I associated love with usefulness. If I wasn't needed, I felt unnecessary. If I wasn't contributing emotionally, I felt invisible. So choosing myself meant confronting the fear that without my effort, I might lose my place in people's lives. That fear runs deep for many women. We're taught explicitly and implicitly that love is something we maintain, that relationships survive because of our emotional labor, that pulling back is dangerous, but love that only exists when you're performing care isn't love, it's dependence, and dependence erodes intimacy. As I practice self-love without performance, I notice something uncomfortable but liberating. Some people didn't like it. Some relationships shifted. Some expectations quietly dissolved. I didn't explain myself, not because I was trying to make a point, but because explanation felt like another performance. And the people who could stay without that performance the ones who didn't require constant reassurance or emotional translation. Those relationships felt different, lighter, more mutual. The others faded, not dramatically, just naturally. That was hard. But it was also honest. Self-love without performance doesn't protect you from loss. It clarifies it. It shows you which connections were built on who you are and which were built on what you provide. I had to accept that choosing myself would sometimes feel lonely, that it would remove the familiar noise of obligation, that it would create space I didn't know how to fill. But that space wasn't empty. It was unclaimed. And in that space, I started to feel something new. Not excitement, not confidence, not certainty, but quiet alignment. I stopped narrating my growth. I stopped turning my boundaries into lessons. I stopped needing my choices to make sense to anyone else. I let them exist. Self-love, I've learned, is not an act of improvement. It's an act of permission. Permission to rest without justification. A permission to say no without softening it. Permission to choose what feels true without promising it will make you better, happier, or easier to be around. It's trusting that your needs don't need to be impressive to be valid. And if that kind of self-love feels uncomfortable, isolating, or even wrong at first, it doesn't mean you're failing. It means you're finally loving yourself without an audience. That's not a performance. That's a relationship. The quiet middle, living without a clear answer. There is a phase of life no one prepares you for because it doesn't look like a crisis. Nothing is falling apart. Nothing is obviously wrong. From the outside, your life appears settled, perhaps even enviable. You've lived enough years to know who you are not, and you've gathered enough evidence to prove you're capable. You've survived heartbreaks, built routines, learned how to take care of yourself and others. And yet, there comes a moment when clarity quietly leaves the room. Not dramatically, not all at once. It slips away during ordinary days, while driving a familiar route, while folding laundry, while sitting in silence after a long conversation that somehow didn't touch the real part of you. This is the quiet middle, the space between who you were and who you're becoming, when the old answers no longer work but the new ones haven't arrived yet. The place where certainty dissolves and no replacement shows up to reassure you. We don't have a language for this phase. We only talk about beginnings and endings, breakdowns and breakthroughs, reinvention and resolution. We celebrate women who leave, women who rise, women who find themselves again. But we don't know what to do with women who are simply here, living, functioning, questioning quietly. I didn't notice when I entered this space. I only noticed when I stopped wanting the things that once motivated me, when timelines lost their urgency, when the pressure to explain my life, to myself and others, began to feel heavier than the uncertainty itself. I wasn't lost in the sense people imagine. I wasn't searching for a new identity or a dramatic change. I just no longer felt aligned with the idea that life should be moving towards something specific at all times. That realization was unsettling. We are taught that not knowing is dangerous, that uncertainty means stagnation, that a lack of clear direction is something to fix as quickly as possible. So when clarity disappears, we rush to replace it with plans, with goals, and with narratives that make us feel legible again. I tried that at first. I told myself I just needed a new focus, a new structure, something to strive for. I assumed the discomfort meant I was behind or avoiding something important. But the harder I pushed for answers, the quieter everything inside me became. Eventually, I had to admit a truth I didn't want to face. I wasn't meant to have an answer right now. The quiet middle isn't a problem to solve. It's a place to inhabit, and inhabiting it requires a kind of patience most of us were never taught. This phase strips away urgency. It removes the illusion that life needs to make sense in neat chapters. It asks you to live without the comfort of certainty, without the validation of progress, without the reassurance of knowing what comes next. And that can feel like failure if you measure your worth by movement. But there is a different kind of growth that happens here, one that doesn't announce itself. In the quiet middle, you begin to notice what remains when striving falls away, what you reach for when no one is watching, what you value when there's nothing to prove, what you avoid when you're not busy enough to distract yourself. This is where many women become uncomfortable, because this space reveals how much of their identity was built around function, around roles, around being useful, productive, reliable, necessary. When those structures loosen, the question becomes unavoidable. Who am I when I'm not becoming something? I had to sit with that question longer than I wanted to. There were days when I felt untethered, days when the absence of a clear path made me restless, and days when I questioned whether I was wasting time by not knowing. But slowly, something else began to emerge. Without a future version of myself to chase, I became more present with the version I was already living. I noticed small preferences I had ignored, subtle desires that had been drowned out by obligation, emotional truths that had no immediate application but felt honest nonetheless. The quiet middle doesn't give you answers. It gives you awareness. And awareness is harder to live with than certainty. Because awareness doesn't tell you what to do. It simply shows you what is. It shows you where you're still performing, where you're still accommodating, where you're still waiting for permission to want something different. This phase also reveals how deeply we've internalized timelines that don't belong to us. Cultural expectations, generational scripts, invisible deadlines that create anxiety without offering meaning. In the quiet middle, those timelines begin to dissolve. You realize you're not running out of time. You're just no longer running on borrowed expectations, and that realization can feel disorienting before it feels liberating. I stopped asking myself when things would make sense again, and started asking a gentler question. What feels true right now? Not what feels impressive, not what feels productive, not what would sound good if I had to explain it, just what feels true. Sometimes the answer was uncomfortable. Sometimes it was boring. Sometimes it was simply, I don't know. And that had to be enough. Living without a clear answer requires trust, not in outcomes, but in process. And it asks you to believe that clarity is not something you force, but something that emerges when you stop demanding it. This goes against everything we've been taught. We're told to set intentions, to define goals, to map out our lives. And there is value in that, until there isn't. The quiet middle arrives when those tools no longer apply, when planning feels hollow and motivation feels performative, when your inner world asks for something slower, quieter, less defined. It's tempting to label this phase as stagnation, to assume you're stuck. But stagnation feels heavy and resistant. This feels different. This feels like suspension, like standing on a bridge between identities, aware that going back isn't possible, but not yet ready to move forward. There is grief here. Grief for the certainty you once had, for the confidence that came from knowing what you wanted, for the version of yourself who believed clarity was permanent. We don't talk enough about that grief. We rush women through it. We encourage them to figure it out, to find their next chapter, to trust the process in ways that minimize the reality of sitting in not knowing. But the quiet middle doesn't respond to pressure. It responds to presence. It asks you to listen instead of decide, to feel instead of plan, to allow instead of control. This phase is not glamorous. It doesn't produce results you can measure. It won't give you a story to tell at dinner parties, but it will give you something else, slowly and quietly. Integrity, the kind that comes from no longer forcing alignment with lives you've outgrown. The kind that comes from honoring uncertainty instead of numbing it. The kind that comes from living honestly, even when that honesty has no clear direction yet. I no longer rush myself out of this space. I let days be unfinished. I let questions remain open. I let myself exist without needing to define the meaning of it all. This doesn't mean I've given up. It means I've stopped pretending that life needs to resolve itself on my timeline. The quiet middle teaches you that you can be whole without being certain, that you can be grounded without having a plan, that you can be alive in a life that hasn't revealed its next shape yet. And maybe the most radical truth of all is this: you don't need a clear answer to live a meaningful life. Sometimes meaning isn't found in direction, but in attention, but in how gently you treat yourself while you don't know, in how honestly you live without a script, in how willing you are to stay present in a chapter that doesn't offer conclusions. If you're here, if you're listening from this in-between place, I want you to know something without trying to fix it. You are not behind. You are not failing. You are not wasting time. You are in the middle. And the middle is not a mistake. It's where the noise fades. It's where performance falls away. It's where your life stops asking to be explained and starts asking to be lived, slowly, quietly, without a clear answer. And somehow, that is enough. When I look back at everything I've shared, I see a story that doesn't follow a dramatic arc. There was no single moment where everything collapsed. No turning point that announced itself loudly enough to be recognized in real time. What I see instead is a slow, quiet unfolding. A woman moving through her life doing what she was supposed to do, and then slowly realizing that supposed to was no longer enough to tell her how to live. I moved through friendships that lasted longer than the truth inside them. I stayed because history felt heavier than honesty, because leaving without a clear reason felt like betrayal. I learned how easy it is to confuse loyalty with self-erasure, and how quietly loneliness can grow inside relationships that once felt like home. I didn't leave those friendships angry. I left them aware, and that awareness came with grief, not for the people themselves, but for the versions of me that no longer belonged there. I dated without chaos, thinking that the absence of drama meant I was doing something right. But what I discovered was subtler and harder to name. I wasn't choosing from desire. I was choosing from politeness, from emotional responsibility, from the belief that wanting more was unrealistic, indulgent, or immature at this stage of life. The exhaustion didn't come from heartbreak. It came from repeatedly ignoring my own intuition in favor of being reasonable. Then there was the quiet shock of healthy love. Not fireworks, not intensity, not emotional vertigo, just steadiness. And I didn't trust it at first. I waited for something to go wrong because calm felt unfamiliar. I realized how deeply I had learned to associate love with adrenaline, and how unsettling it was to be seen without having to perform, fix, or prove anything. Healthy relationships didn't make my life louder. They made it clearer. And clarity, I learned, can feel just as confronting as chaos. I reached goals I once believed would define me. And when they didn't deliver the meaning I expected, I felt a strange emptiness I didn't know how to talk about. I had become the person capable of achieving those things long before they arrived, so when they did, they felt ordinary. That wasn't failure, It was evolution. But no one tells you how disorienting it is to outgrow your own ambitions. No one prepares you for the moment when striving stops working as a compass. And then there was self-love, not the aesthetic version, not the version that sounds good in theory, the real one, the uncomfortable one, the kind that doesn't explain itself. I learned how often I had turned self-care into a performance, how often I justified my needs so others wouldn't feel inconvenienced by them. Loving myself without an audience meant disappointing people, sitting with guilt that didn't belong to the present, and letting go of the identity I had built around being easy, capable, and emotionally fluent. It wasn't empowering, it was quiet, and it was honest. All of this brought me to the quiet middle, the place where old answers no longer worked and new ones hadn't arrived yet. The place without labels, without urgency, without a clear direction forward. From the outside, my life looked stable. From the inside, certainty had dissolved, and that was terrifying, until I stopped treating it like a problem to solve. What I've come to understand is that this phase isn't a failure of clarity. It's an invitation to live without pretending you have one. The lesson woven through this entire story is simple but not easy to live. Discomfort is not always a signal to fix something. Sometimes it's a signal that you're finally paying attention. We've been taught to rush ourselves through uncertainty, to replace questions with plans, to treat not knowing as weakness. But the quiet middle asks for something different. It asks for presence instead of pressure. It asks you to stop performing certainty and start listening to what remains when performance falls away. So how do you apply this to your life, practically, without turning it into another self-improvement project? You start by telling yourself the truth in small ways. You notice where you feel subtly diminished and where you feel most like yourself. You stop explaining your boundaries to make them easier to digest. Then you let go of relationships, habits, and goals that no longer fit, even if they once did, without rewriting history to justify the change. You allow yourself to rest without earning it, to pause without a plan, to exist without a narrative arc. You don't rush to redefine yourself. You let yourself be undefined for a while. Most importantly, you stop treating this phase as something to escape, because the quiet middle is where integrity is rebuilt. It's where your life stops being organized around who you should be and starts responding to who you actually are. You don't need a dramatic transformation. You don't need a new identity. You don't need to be fixed. You need permission to be here. And that brings me to the truth that holds everything together. The one I want you to carry with you after this video ends. You're not broken. You're just in the middle. Before you go, I want to ask you a small question. Don't overthink it. Just notice what resonates most and comment your answer below. Question A. I'm trying to figure out what's next. B. I'm learning how to be where I am. Comment A or B and let me know why you chose it. And if you feel comfortable, I'd love to hear your perspective. What part of this story felt closest to your own life right now? What questions are you quietly carrying that no one ever gave you space to ask? Share your thoughts in the comments so others can read them too. Sometimes the most healing thing is realizing someone else is standing in the same place. If this conversation felt honest, if it put language to something you've been living silently, please subscribe to the channel. Not just to support the work, but to help keep this space alive. This kind of content only continues when people choose depth over noise. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening slowly. And I'll see you in the next conversation.